So which are the best settings for landscape photography? This is a commonly asked question, and there is no one right answer to this question. So in this video I will walk you through the 7 settings I always consider before I take photos. Hi there, I'm Kim from Landscape to Art, and I'm here to help you improve your landscape photography, focusing on developing your skills as a photographer and less on the gear you use. And if this is your first time here, make sure you click the subscribe button below. A typical question among beginner photographers is, what camera settings should I use? And this question is understandable from a beginner's point of view. Because for beginners the camera might seem overwhelming with all the buttons and menus. And a craftsman, if you look at a craftsman, he must decide first what the job in front of him is about, what he's going to produce. And just when he knows what is required to get the job done, he picked the right tools from the toolbox. Photography is nothing different. You must first take a look at the scene in front of you and how you can get the most out of the scene. When you know and you have a creative idea, you can select the camera settings that will give you these results. So let's get started and have a look at the most important 7 camera settings for a landscape photographer. Setting number 1 is RAW or JPEG files. I really recommend you always save your files as RAW files if you can. This is particularly important when you want to edit your photo and get the most out of your post-processing. You will have so much more image data to work with when you compare to the JPEG file. And in my opinion, you should use RAW even if you currently don't edit your photos, because you never know what you might decide later. When you save a file as JPEG, the camera will automatically apply some basic editing to the photo, and the JPEG file will be compressed and any excess data will be discarded. You will not be able to get the lost image data back should you later find that you needed to post-process the file. It's gone forever. I did not save my files as RAW files for a long time after I got my first camera where I could save RAW files. And it's probably one of the mistakes I have regretted the most since I started to take landscape photos. I have a few images I probably could have improved significantly with post-processing, but with only the small JPEG file available now, it's limited what I can do. If you are unsure if you need RAW files or not, set the camera to save both JPEG and RAW. You won't regret it. And setting number 2 is the histogram. You should always turn the histogram on, and more importantly, learn how to read the histogram. The histogram is especially important in landscape photography, where the light conditions can be difficult. The histogram warns you if you over or underexpose your photos. And it's most important to keep an eye on the highlights, because you cannot fix blown highlights when you edit. If you're shooting at night when the light is limited, the image on the LCD screen might look very bright. This can falsely lead you to think that the image is overexposed. And since the LCD can trick you, the histogram is very useful when you shoot at night. It will tell you if you are within the limit with the exposures. So the histogram is a representation of a processed JPEG file in the camera. And with the RAW file you will always have more image data to work with when you edit, even if the shadow looks completely dark on the LCD, on the JPEG file. The most important is to make sure the histogram is not spiking up the right side. If it does, you have overexposed the highlights, and that's typically the sky. And setting number 3 is white balance. As long as you save your files as RAW files, white balance doesn't really matter, because you can set the white balance later when you edit. As I save all my files as RAW, I just select daylight setting on the white balance and I just leave it there for most of my photos. White balance is subjective, and there is really no right or wrong in landscape photography. The best white balance is the one that gives you the results that you are after, that you envisioned when you took the photo. So don't obsess about the white balance. If your camera doesn't support RAW or you only use JPEG files, you should be more aware of the white balance setting. The best approach in this case is to use the white balance that are closest to the actual light and the weather conditions. So if it is cloudy, use the cloudy setting, and if it's sunshine, use the daylight setting. Cameras are pretty good at determining the color of the light, so the auto white balance will also work well in most situations. But there are a couple of exceptions you should be aware of. If you're photographing colorful sunset or during the blue hour and the white balance is set to auto, the camera will try to neutralize the colors, and that's of course not what you want. In these situations, I recommend to use the daylight setting and keep the colors right. The best you can do is to experiment with the white balance and find out which setting works best for the different scenes in your camera. And setting number 4 is light metering mode. Metering is how the camera determines the right exposure for a scene. The camera tries to balance the exposure evenly for the whole image. And when the scene is evenly lit, most cameras have no problem with the exposure. It's when you have high contrast scenes or difficult light that you might run into trouble and where you must take control over the camera yourself. You have probably experienced the difficulties when you have a bright sky and a dark foreground in the composition. In this case, you have to decide which area to expose for, and typically you expose for the sky in this case. Most cameras have 3 main light metering modes. The first metering mode is matrix, and on Nikon it's called matrix, but I think it's called evaluative on Canons. Matrix metering mode measures the average of the whole frame. The camera gives more weight to the areas around where the focus points are set than to the rest of the frame. And matrix mode works well in most situations. The second setting is center-weighted metering. With center-weighted metering, the camera prioritizes and measures the light in the center of the frame. And this setting is typically more useful when you have the main subject near the center, like when you photograph portraits or wildlife. And the third metering mode is spot metering. With spot metering, you can measure the light in specific areas in the frame, like where you have the brightest or most important areas. In tricky light conditions, I often use spot metering on the sky or areas near the sun because it gives me more control. Which light metering mode you use is not the most critical. If the exposure is off, you have to use exposure compensation to adjust it anyhow. Setting number 5 is focus mode. Focus is one of the most challenging parts in photography. And in landscape photography, we typically want the whole scene to be in focus. And to do this, you will often have to take full control of the camera. You basically have 2 main focus modes, auto and manual focus. With autofocus, you leave it to the camera, everything to the camera. And this works fine when the scene is simple and you have no elements close to the lens. So like if you're photographing a mountain range or something in the distance, everything is at infinity and the focus is less of a problem. Manual focus is the best option when the scene is complicated with a lot of layers and you have foreground elements close to the lens. And the most critical with focusing is to make sure that you are actually focusing on the right areas in the scene where you want the camera to focus. In auto mode, the camera might focus on something else than you have planned for. And this can be things like trees, tree branches or grass in front of the lens. When this happens, you have to focus manually or move the focus point to a different place. If you need to focus on a specific area, you can actually select a single focus point and move the focus point around in the frame where you want to focus. I use manual focus most of the time when I take landscape photos, as it gives me much more control. Manual adjustments are a little slower, but in landscape photography, normally you have enough time. You might also need to switch to manual focus in low light situations, because many cameras tend to struggle with the focus when there is little light or low contrast. Also, if you need to bracket and take multiple shots, it's also a good idea to set the camera to manual focus, because you don't want any changes in focus between the shots. And setting number 6 is camera shooting modes. Many cameras typically have several scene modes as well as full auto modes, auto and program mode. And in addition, most cameras have the two semi-automatic modes, shutter and aperture priority, and of course the manual mode. Which of the semi-automated modes you should use depends on the scene and, more importantly, your creative decisions. With the camera set to full auto, the green setting, which is the most common among beginner photographers, you leave it all to the camera to make the exposure. Auto mode works well most of the time, exposure wise, but you will miss all the creative possibilities you have with photography. To take your landscape photography to the next level, you should give the semi-automatic modes a try. In aperture priority, you basically tell the camera, I'm setting the aperture for you, and you decide the best shutter speed. Aperture controls how much of the scene from foreground to background that is in focus. And getting enough depth of field is one of the biggest challenges in landscape photography. Aperture plays an important role in this, and having full control of the aperture setting is a must in many landscape photos. The closer to the lens any of the elements in a scene are, the more important is the aperture. And in these situations, you must use smaller apertures like f11 or f22. There are a lot of talk about lens diffraction and sweet spots, but I believe it's better to have a slightly soft image than one that is not sharp throughout. When I need maximum depth of field, I stop down my lens with no hesitation. If the subject is in the far distance and you have no close foreground, the aperture is of less importance. In this case, the whole image will be in focus even with the widest apertures. Aperture priority is the best choice when you auto bracket images. Because if you let the camera change the aperture between the shots, the change in depth of field will be visible in the final photo, and you will have more difficulties when you merge the photos in the editing software. In shutter priority, you tell the camera, I set the shutter speed, and you decide the aperture. Shutter speed is only important if something is moving in a scene, like water, the clouds, or leaves on trees. And in this case, you can make a creative decision. Do you want to freeze the movement or blur the movement? Shutter speed is also important to consider if you handheld the camera and use longer shutter speeds, because you risk to introduce camera movement. But when you use a tripod, you can use almost any shutter speed. The only reason to consider shutter speed when you use a tripod is the creative effects that you can achieve by adjusting different shutter speeds. I typically use manual mode in difficult light situations and when I want full control over both shutter speed and aperture. When I shoot at night, like northern light photography, I set my camera to manual mode. And in total dark, the light metering is not reliable. And setting number 7 is ISO. ISO is closely related to aperture and shutter speed, but I have chosen to cover ISO separately. ISO is the third setting in addition to aperture and shutter speed that influences on the exposure. And many beginners get confused by the ISO. Trying to figure out two settings, aperture and shutter speed, is challenging enough, but when you introduce the third one in the equation, ISO, it gets even more confusing and complicated. Unlike aperture and shutter speed, ISO really has no influence on the aesthetics of the photos. Therefore, you should always start with the ISO at the base setting, which is between 50 and 100 on most cameras. Basically, you should only increase the ISO in situations when the light is limited, like in night photography. Another situation where you might need to increase ISO is when you want to maintain a given combination of aperture and shutter speed to achieve a certain creative look in a photo. If this combination results in an underexposed photo, you can increase the ISO to compensate. As you have seen, the camera settings are strongly dependent on the scene and how you want the image to look. And as soon as you start to understand this, you will approach the settings differently. The settings are determined by your creative choices and not the opposite. The setting you should consider the most is the focus and exposure adjustments, because these are the settings that can really ruin your photo if you get it wrong. So now, if you like this video, consider giving it a thumbs up, and thank you so much for watching. And as usual, if you have any comments or questions, post them in the comment section below. I promise I will get back to you. And so then, until next time, ha det bra, goodbye.